Good morning. So let us now recapitulate what we have done so far on the historical background to the introduction to modern Indian drama. Right. So we began by talking about the earliest histories of Indian theatre, which were written by Horace Hayman Wilson's three-volume Select Specimens of the Theatre of the Hindus, which was published in 1827 in Calcutta, and Sylvain Levy's two-volume The Indian Theatre, which were both clearly influenced by Orientalism in that they equated Indian theatre with Sanskrit theatre, while dismissing the multilingual nature of Indian theatre, be it Sanskrit and other non-Sanskritic forms of theatre and performance. The colonial historiography of Indian theatre follows the Western chronological categories of ancient, medieval, and modern, where Sanskrit theatre lasted from 200 BC, medieval or traditional theatre lasted from 1000 CE to the present, and modern theatre from the late 18th century to the present. Sanskrit theatre was modelled on Bharata's Natya Shastra, the ancient text on dramaturgy, which provided copious data on theoretical and practical aspects of theatre, from acting and dancing to music and prosody, the sizes and shapes of playhouses, costumes and makeup, theories of emotions and sentiments, requirements for critics and audiences, and so on. One of the earliest Sanskrit plays to be translated and studied by Orientalist missionaries and scholars were Kalidasa's Avijnana Shakuntala, translated by William Jones and published in Calcutta in 1789, which was actually a multilingual play with lines in Sanskrit, Shauraseni, Maharashtri, and Magadhi, and Shudraka's Mritya or Little Clay Cart, which again comprised of many other languages that were lost in translation. Then we also looked at how there were other folk performative traditions of theatre that colonial theatre also incorporated into its own performances. And a lot of these folk performative theatres rested on music and dance, which were absolutely indispensable to forms. But many of these traditions of music and dance were dismissed or overlooked by colonial scholars as crude and low forms of performance art. Colonial era theatre drew on Western conventions of theatre in terms of lighting and scenography, while shunning local forms of theatre as crude. But there was a turn back to pre-modern Sanskritic models of theatre which came to be revalued as classical because of nationalist aspirations. The attempt was to build an Indian nation that was both traditional and modern through a return to Hindu Puranic traditions. Thus, the creation of Indianness was a political issue. The establishment of Indology in the mid-18th century enabled the possibility of this return to Sanskrit theatre because of the interest that European scholars had in understanding India's past. Thus, Sanskrit texts, both religious and secular, came to be preserved and transmitted. Even later histories of Indian theatre, like Hemendra Nath Dasgupta's 4-volume The Indian Stage, published in Calcutta between 1944 and 1946, and Ramlal Kanailal's Yagnik's The Indian Theatre, did not acknowledge the presence of other theatre performance traditions in India. Many of the later histories of Indian theatre, written after independence, continue to emphasize the lasting importance of Sanskrit theatre on Indian theatre. Many actors did not have a sense of Western forms of the theatre and acting, and incorporated folk techniques into their performances despite the growing modernization of Indian theatre. Under the rule of the East India Company, the early playhouses were set up in Calcutta. In 1775 was Calcutta Theatre, the Chaurangi Theatre in 1813, the Sanssouci Theatre in 1839, which were patronized by colonial officials. The colonial idea of theatre understood theatre as an enclosed space with a raised proscenium stage before rows of seats. It made theatre a spectacle to be watched by the audience who were at the same or higher level than the stage. Colonial theatre was an elite cultural art form that was patronized and frequented by the colonial Western and Indian elite, particularly the Parsis of Bombay, who sponsored the early theatre companies. It was only in the late 19th century that theatre spread as a form of mass entertainment in Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras to schools and colleges. Theatre became a commercial, ticketed event, and there was a new distinction between the actor-manager and the director. So, if the folk performance traditions of India relied solely on the actor and his body, the director becomes an important figure who emerges in urban theatre, who is the one who may not necessarily act in the play, but is the one who enables the actors to actually incorporate certain folk and Western forms of performance. The mere importation of the proscenium theatre did not modernize Indian theatre. Indian theatre in the 1770s was still an elite form of entertainment that was limited to small British populations in the three presidency cities of Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. The early plays that were staged in the latter decades of the 18th century addressed social issues like polygamy, child marriage, opium addiction, fate-sanctioned violence, the plight of Indian women, and so on. Dinabandhu Mitra's Neel Darpan is a famous example, which was a polemical attack on the exploitative British indigo planters, which was banned as seditious and precipitated the passing of the Dramatic Performances Act in 1876 to curb seditious and patriotic tendencies. Theatre scholar Anandalal argues that, and this is of course another important 19th century Indian playwright, whom we'll be discussing in greater detail in this session. Just a few points introducing Rabindranath Tagore's contribution to modern Indian theatre. Theatre scholar Anandalal argues that Rabindranath Tagore was the pivotal figure in modern Indian drama in terms of his imaginative stagecraft, modelled after a Sanskrit aesthetics that attempted to transform Western theatrical modes of domestic realism and picturesque entertainment. His plays were controversial for the time as they dealt with female sexuality, the orthodoxies of Hinduism, untouchability, and also anticipated environmental concerns and revisited Buddhism as a pacific faith. This is a quote from Anandalal's introduction to his translation of three plays by Rabindranath Tagore. Tagore was also known for introducing women to the stage, which included women even from quote-unquote respectable families at a time when male actors impersonated women. The beginnings of modern Indian theatre can be traced back to Parsi theatre. Parsi theatre was the dominant form of entertainment in urban India from the 1860s to 1930s. Early colonial era theatre companies were owned by elite Parsis, many of whom were wealthy bankers, traders, and philanthropists. The term Parsi theatre itself is a conflicting one, as the actors who joined these companies were Muslims, Hindus, Anglo-Indians, and Baghdadi Jews. Their plays were also multilingual and performed largely in Gujarati, Marathi, and Urdu, and English too. These plays were designed along Western notions of stagecraft, like backdrop scenery, and were divided into acts and scenes. Many of these plays were published with detailed prefaces by the playwrights that illuminated their choice of language and the relationship to public. The Indian elites in Bombay, which included the Parsis, were invited to attend English language Bombay theatre, also known as Theatre on the Green. Later on, an appeal was made by various notables like Jamshed Gigi Boy, Jagannath Shankar Seth, and Frame G. Koasji to found the Grant Road Theatre, which was located in the fort area of the native town to cater to the need of non-English language Indian plays. Until 1853, all performances in Grant Road Theatre were in English. Between 1865 and 1890, English was sidelined and the rivalry was between Gujarati and Urdu plays. All this information can be found in Catherine Hanson's essays on Parsi theatre. Grant Road was later supplemented by enlarged ones such as the Gaiety and Novelty near Victoria Railway Terminus. Established theatre companies like Elphinstone, Victoria, and Alfred left behind their roots in amateur theatre and became more profitable for their Parsi owners. Shakespeare's plays were also adapted in these performances. There was an attempt by Parsi writers and intellectuals to build a history of their own in Gujarati that they traced back to Firdausi, the ancient king of the Parsis. They performed tales for the Shahnama, Rustam and Sohrab, and so on, which equated the Parsi theatre to the mythical history of the Persian homeland. There was also the presence of the so-called Hindu theatre in Bombay, which was driven by the notion of theatre for the Hindu people, propagated by William Jones and H. H. Wilson's translations from Sanskrit drama. These plays adopted regional folk styles. The Parsis were thus not Anglophilic, as was assumed, as they were keen on carving a distinct cultural identity for themselves through theatre. Dadabhai Sorabji Patel, or Dadi Patel M.A., was a wealthy intellectual who became the secretary of the Victoria Theatrical Company in 1869, who commissioned the first play in Urdu, although knowledge of the language was initially lacking among playwrights, actors, and spectators. He popularized opera and professionalized theatre with full-time salaries and introducing so-called scientific stagecraft. Urdu plays were initially written in Gujarati script. Urdu was favored also because of its traditions of poetry and music and song. The most important Urdu play that set off a new tradition of playwriting in Urdu was Inder Sabha by Agha Hassan Amanat in 1853. Although Hindu women were largely forbidden from acting on stage, there were male impersonators who played women and Anglo-Indian and Jewish actresses on stage. The performance of femininity on stage was a visual construction of bourgeois respectability on stage that contained her sexuality and created a new interiority, identifying the ideal woman with her capacity to suffer. Again, these are observations that Catherine Henson makes on female impersonation on the Parsi stage. Parsi theatrical companies traveled far to Ceylon, Calcutta, Rangoon, Peshawar, and Sindh. Writers, actors, company managers, musicians, etc., belong to a mix of class, caste, and religious backgrounds. Much of the anecdotal evidence of female impersonation is drawn from Catherine Hanson's translation of Somnath Gupta's scholarly Hindi monograph on Parsi theatre, which was based on the theatre notices of one-time actor and photographer Dhanji Bhai Patel and the autobiographical pieces of female impersonators like Narayan Prasad Betab and Fida Hussain. With the establishment of the Victoria Theatrical Company in 1868, Parsi theatre became more professionalized when compared to the earlier notch performances by feudal aristocrats. Men with a pleasing figure and voice were required. When the Victoria Theatrical Company split, the former manager Dadi Patel took all the leading female impersonators with him to form the original Victoria Theatrical Company, leaving the next manager at a loss. Again, an anecdote quoted from Catherine Hanson's essay on female impersonation in Parsi theatre. Female impersonation continued into the 20th century. There are few records of these actors' lives, with the exception of the non-Parsi actors like Jayashankar Sundari, 1888 to 1967, and Bal Gandharva, 1889 to 1975. And Catherine Henson discusses these different male actors who played women in greater detail in her book called Stages of Life, where she has fairly lengthy introduction to the lives of these actors, along with a translation of their autobiographical pieces, of their experiences of playing women on stage. The female impersonator averted the potential slander and criticism directed to a transvestite. It thinly cloaked an aggressive heterosexual masculinity, and by performing the wrong woman, the female impersonator was rendered harmless and worthy of sympathy. This is, of course, again, Catherine Henson's observation of how female impersonators managed to actually tame and domesticate their masculine vigor and aggression by performing a wrong woman, a woman who was stigmatized and oppressed by social norms. And also by making her suffer infinitely, made her into an object of public sympathy. The belief that men could do gender better than women perpetuated the control that men had over the theatre system and the public control over the female body and its representation. So again, this is again the fact that only men performed women for the longest time, or for most of the times, and that itself became a way of perpetuating the control that men had over the theatrical apparatus and the female body and the representation of female femininity and suffering. The Anglo-Indian and Jewish actresses who played women passed off as Indian while embodying modernity through their fair skin in modern ways. So you also had women who played women on stage, but these were not Hindu women. They were Anglo-Indian and Jewish actresses who had fair skin but nonetheless tried to pass off as Hindu women on stage. There was an opposition to the participation of women on stage by the eminent Gujarati playwright K.N. Kabra, who formed the Natak Uttejak Mandali in opposition to the Victoria Theatrical Company that encouraged female involvement. But he also encouraged women to watch plays. The new Alfred Theatrical Company, which split from the parent company in 1891, again opposed the presence of women on stage. Dadi Patel employed many Muslim women in his production of Inder Sabha. The Anglo-Indian woman who began acting in Parsi theatre adopted Hindu names, which signified an act of subordinating the Anglo-Indian actress, the feminine embodiment of the West, to the Indian male gaze. The actresses were cast in the image of the Huri or pale fairy, a familiar Indo-Islamic trope. So you have the Anglo-Indian woman playing Hindu women, adopting Hindu names, and signifying an act of subordination of the Anglo-Indian actress to the gaze of the Indian male. The photographic image of the actresses on billboards and magazines were titillating in their impact, leading the public to believe that they would witness foreign actresses perform. The Anglo-Indian actresses were thus both native as well as exotic other. Indian modern theatre drew from local folk traditions like Yakshagana, Tamasha, Ras Leela, Nautanki, Bhavai, Jatra and Khayal. Many of the post-independence dramatists like Habib Tanvir and Bal Sarkar, Girish Karnad and Vijay Tendulkar turned to folk traditions as what they thought was the essence of Indian theatre. The aim was to establish the importance of the actor as opposed to the urban playwright and the communal involvement and ritualistic action of rural societies. Hindi and Urdu theatre traditions drew from primarily religious Ram Leela or Ras Leela traditions or secular ones like Nautanki or Swang. Again, Catherine Hansen has a longer study on the Nautanki in her book on the Nautanki traditions of theatre acting. Now, let's just turn to an introduction to some of the major pre-independence playwrights in India. The early pre-independence playwrights like Bharatendu Harishchandra, 1850 to 1885 in Hindi, Jayashankar Prasad, 1890 to 1937 again in Hindi, and Rabindranath Tagore, 1961 to 1941 in Bengali, were influenced by models of classical Sanskrit theatre. Prasad and Tagore shunned commercial theatre, which they believed was antithetical to their aesthetics and undermined the literary merit of the play. Most of Tagore's plays were performed in the privacy of his home, and Tagore acted as well as directed his own plays. Bharatendu Harishchandra was highly impacted by the German playwright Bertolt Brecht. In her book on Harishchandra and Prasad, Poetics, Plays and Performances, The Politics of Modern Indian Theatre, Vasudha Dalmia reveals the impact that Sanskrit theatre had on Harishchandra. Dalmia observes that the national Indian theatre of the Hindus drew from the understanding and adaptations of Sanskrit theatre and Shakespeare. Unlike the metropolitan centres of Bombay, where Parsi theatre had become hugely popular, and Calcutta, the capital of British Imperial India, where the earliest houses were set up, there was no such metropolis in the Hindi-Urdu belt of North India. The scene of Urdu Hindi theatre, which is becoming the new literary language of the country, shifted from Awadh after Wajid Ali Shah's end to Banaras. Harishchandra belonged to a merchant family of Banaras, which had become one of the most important banking and trading centres of northern India. Harishchandra belonged to the Naupati Mahajans, aristocratic bankers who arbitrated disputes among merchant classes and mediated between British and the people of the city. Harishchandra's friendship with the Maharaja contributed to the expansion of the Ram Leela of Ramnagar. He organized many gatherings of poets and musical evenings and maintained relations with the Asian Society of Bengal in Calcutta. Although his lifestyle was rather extravagant and elite, his theatre addressed a heterogeneous audience and reading public of Brahmins, mobile artisans, and merchants that formed a political and socially operative public sphere. Even as he drew from Sanskrit categories, he also took recourse to popular forms in music and avoided the vulgar and the low to minimize the stigma of theatre. His early plays were translations of Sanskrit, Prakrit, Bengali, and Shakespeare. Dalmia argues that Harishchandra's lively social, religious, and political satires coexisted with a future vision of the nation to be, which fell back on Rajput models of sovereignty. His radical critiques of existing structures of authority, Dalmia notes, were tempered by the very structures of authority that he was a part of. The merchant Rajput nexus that were linked up with romantic Orientalist visions of the past, such as that of Edwin Arnold, the literary critic. From her reading of Harishchandra's long essay on drama called Natak, 1883, Harishchandra believed Sanskrit theatre had to be renewed to assimilate the new and traditional goals and conventions of drama, had to cater to the interests of contemporary politics and aesthetics, and thirdly, there had to be an appraisal of progress and the prospects of vernacular drama and the fraught questions of patronage in the creation of an incipient national theatre. For Harishchandra, drama was drishya kavya or visual poetry. whose authors were Brahma, Shiva, Bharata, Narada, Vyasa, and Valmiki, though its first exponent was Bharata. According to Harishchandra, drama has three divisions: poetry mixed or poetical, Mishra Kavya, which is further subdivided into ancient and modern. The ancient was Sanskrit drama, which according to him was not a lowly form of art but performed by all social groups for all. He tries to stretch Sanskrit categories into the present. In the modern category are included plays modelled on European drama, which are characterized by the repeated change of scene, which was implemented by the change in backdrop. Modern plays were further divided into natak or drama, where narrative is predominant, and Giti Rupak or musical drama, where narrative is punctuated by song. These plays can have a tragic or tragic comic ending. The second category of drama was pure spectacle or curiosity or Shuddha Kautuk, and the third category corrupt or Bhrashta. The second category includes puppetry, mime, and feats of skill, and the third category includes those forms that once had theatricality but have now degenerated and become devoid of poetry. These include popular forms like Bhand, Indasabha, Tamasha, and Yatra, and religious traditions like Rasa, Leela, and Jhanki. These are all taken from Vasudalmia's book on Harishchandra and Jayashankar Prasad and the impact that Brecht had on these early 19th century playwrights. For Harishchandra, drama had 5 goals: comic, erotic, spectacular, social reform, and patriotism. The last two are discussed, for which old tales have to be reinterpreted. A public forum for the discussion of issues should be created, and where love for the country can be created. Harishchandra believes his play should be educative. The play can become a model of corrective ethical and political action if it becomes a metaphor for reformative practice. This Shakuntala, Ratnavali, and Mrichakatika, Hamlet, and Macbeth were exemplars in this regard, because the actions in these plays best brought out the characters' inner state of mind. So the emphasis for Harishchandra was on capturing the psychological states of mind and the transformations in their psyche in order to enable corrective ethical and political action. And so for him, Shakuntala, Ratnavali, Mrichakatika, Hamlet, and Macbeth are the exemplars of plays of the social reformative and patriotic function of modern Indian theatre. Harishchandra's plays were written in a mix of languages. The verse passages were almost entirely in Braj Bhasha, which resonated with Urdu or Khari Boli, and was a style that was popularized by Amanat's Indasabha. His most important contribution was his translation of Shudraka's Sanskrit play Mudda Rakshasa, that had been translated earlier by H. Wilson, and to whose historical scholarship he is indebted. But in the process of adapting older plays, including the famous Satya Harishchandra, and writing his own, Harishchandra contemporizes them by setting them in Banaras and psychologically elaborating the characters and scenes in the form of popular street performers. Many of his plays were dealt with in a Shakespearean manner in terms of irony and symbolism. Harishchandra was also known for his play Andher Nagari, written in 1881, in the form of a folk tale that was an oblique critique of the tyranny of the British. Even the passing of the Dramatic Performances Act in 1876, playwrights and performers had to devise subtle and creative methods of critiquing the government. Some of Harishchandra's later plays, like Neel Devi, were free of Sanskrit models and written in a more Western mold as a political satire that offered a Hindu-Aryan view of history told from the perspective of Rajput commanders of the Delhi Sultanate, where Muslims were perceived as aggressors and foreigners. With Harishchandra's demise and the consolidation of the British as an administrative power, there was hardly any patronage for Hindi theatre in a region that did not have the political or economic capital of the metropolitan cities of Calcutta or Bombay. Urban Hindi drama became increasingly divorced from folk forms and underwent a renewal only after the official support of Hindi as a national language after independence. However, as Dalmia observes, Hindi theatre also emerged as a literary form divorced from local and folk forms and official patronage that was perfected by Jayashankar Prasad. Jayashankar Prasad, 1886-1937, was also from Banaras and also belonged to a wealthy merchant family and was initially educated at home where he learned Sanskrit, Persian, Hindi and Urdu. His education abruptly ended with the death of his father, but he acquired knowledge of a variety of Sanskrit texts on his own and had a contradictory relationship to the traditional past. If, on the one hand, his relationships with women was framed within the patriarchal mold, he would also fiercely demand equal rights for women. Although Prasad wrote plays and stories, he was best known for his lyrical poetry, written in Sanskritized Hindi, that established him as one of the major figures in the new romantic movement of Chayavad poetry. For Prasad, Chayavad embodied the fine ideals of Sanskrit literature that provided poets with a repertoire of emotion and feeling that marked a new form of intimacy and portrayed women with a new dignity in the relationships with men. Hindi had to acquire a new terminology to be able to express the abstraction of emotions of characters and the inner states, and the rhetoric of Chayavad poetry emerged in Prasad's plays at moments of emotional intensity. Chayavad was opposed to Yatharthavad or realism in Hindi that came to be associated exclusively with the pain and suffering of the common masses under colonial rule. Prasad believed this exclusive social realist focus on the societal obstructions to intimate relationships was pessimistic and fatalistic and did not represent characters in all their human dignity and subtlety. He held Harishchandra's plays responsible for this, among what he thought was an imitation of Western realist strain of theatre that reduced individuals to their conflicts with society. The role of literature, according to Prasad, Dalmia notes, was to create characters as a medium for creating rasa or emotion that did not necessarily correspond to but could be indicative of the subtle workings of the psyche. Literature had to fill the deficiencies in both Yatharthavad or reality and Adarshyavad or ideality, for there was no gap in between them. Sanskrit drama, for Prasad, fulfilled the function of literature to be beyond representing history or promulgating social codes. Drama had to be renovated to create optimism in the spectator about the future. Prasad insisted on the creative experience of the self as the soul of poetry and drama, which opened up the possibility of focusing on the subjectivity of the dramatist and his characters. Prasad rejected Parsi theatre for its vulgarity, although, as Dalmia argues, his plays were formally drawn from the frames of Parsi theatre. In the absence of any urban theatre movement, Prasad's plays were meant to be read rather than to be performed, and he believed that drama should adjust itself to the limitations of the existing stage rather than the other way round. Prasad had great love for the Bengali stage and its tasteful adaptations of Western modes of theatre and simple stagecraft. He believed Hindi dramatists would have had the potential to build on the formal possibilities of Parsi theatre had it not been taken over by cinema and the talking film. Cinema had enabled the possibility of women acting, which is something that had not been the case with Parsi theatre. He made several references to Harishchandra in his writings as the only Hindi playwright worthy of note, but was ambivalent towards Harishchandra's devotional aesthetics that he drew from Vaishnava traditions in Bengal. Most of Prasad's plays were taken from the Puranas and ancient history, with protagonists who had divine origins. Dalmia shows how Prasad in his plays addresses women's rights to independence and romantic choice and challenged Brahmanical orthodoxy, particularly practices like sati. For this, Prasad deployed his own readings of historical sources of Hindu law like Kautilya's Arthashastra and Manu's Dharmashastras, which had to be read for their emancipatory possibilities. Thus, Prasad at once seems to uphold and undermine Brahmanical law and his inherent misogyny. Most of his plays borrowed some of the conventions of Western theatre and Parsi theatre in terms of the narrator, melodramatic songs and scenography. Another important early playwright was Rabindranath Tagore, 1861 to 1941, whose plays underwent many transformations. His early plays were influenced by his reading of Shakespeare and the Romantic poets, especially Robert Browning. But his later plays, which focused on man's quest for union with the universe, theatre scholar Anandalal argues, is his own product. This is man's quest for union with the universe was Tagore's own product. Lal suggests that the scholarship and literary critics have insisted on the influence of Western theatre on Tagore's plays, which Lal rightly argues is itself a legacy of colonial education and thought that considers anything that possesses merit to be a derivative of the West. So Anandala is actually arguing against many of the scholars who have criticized Tagore for not being a merit-worthy playwright because he does not imitate or does not entirely draw from Western forms of theatre. Most of the scholarship on Tagore as a dramatist considers him to be a second rate, and he is better known and appreciated for his fiction and poetry. His plays were considered to be unstageable and were meant to be read, some scholars thought. Although, as Lal points out, his plays were performed within the privacy of his home and in specific theatres. Tagore's symbolic plays were considered to be better read as short stories than performed as plays. Anandala suggests that it was the emphasis on naturalistic theatre that made it difficult for critics to accept some of Tagore's more complex symbolic plays to be accepted as plays worth staging. A lot of the damage done to Tagore's reputation as a dramatist had to do with his weak translations of his own plays that did not succeed in capturing the spirit of his plays or often recreated his plays to read like original works in their own right. Translations of his plays into other Indian languages were also mediated by his own English translations. Tagore grew up in a Bengali world of theatre that had adapted and incorporated Western conventions of theatre and had begun to look down upon folk forms like yatra or jatra. The first Bengali playwright, Tarkaratna, 1828 to 1886, had written plays on the plight of Hindu women. Michael Madhusudan Dutt, 1824 to 1873, wrote satirical comedies, and Dinabandhu Mitra, 1830 to 73, produced polemics of the colonial regime, especially Neel Darpan, that had been banned for its attack on the British indigo planters and the exploitation of helpless Bengali peasants. And Girish Chandra Ghosh, 1844 to 1912, was another author of more than 70 mythological and historical plays, who was another important figure in the field of Bengali theatre. Tagore's earliest plays included the musical play Valmiki Pratibha, which he wrote when he was 20 in 1881 and was performed at his family home. His early poetic dramas, Raja Orani, 1889, and Visarjan, 1890, were tragedies modelled after the English Restoration. Chitrangada, 1892, was a lyrical play about human beauty and love that was inspired by Tagore's observations of the Bengali peasant and his mystical relationship with nature during his stay at his family estates in East Bengal. He later tried his hand at blank verse and prose to produce short comic skits and one-act plays. After a series of tragedies in his life that included the loss of his wife, son, daughter, and father, Tagore went on to dramatize his earlier works of fiction and write some of his most well-known plays like Raja, Achalayatun, Dagkar, and Falguni, which were part of a seventh cycle of season plays that began with Sharadotsav. Tagore further rewrote some of his earlier plays to make them more stage-worthy, and towards the end of his play produced two symbolic plays, Muktadhara and Raktugarvi, which satirized the political oppression of subjugated people and the exploitation of natural resources. Tagore grew keen in incorporating dance, especially what were considered rigid classical forms of Indian dance, into his plays to loosen their classical style, to express the emotional intensity of the characters, much to the disapproval of music and dance purists. His later plays gestured his interest in Buddhism and his dissatisfaction with the spoken word, which compelled Tagore to draw from diverse dance traditions both within and outside India. So again, I draw a lot from Anandala's introduction to his translation of three of Tagore's plays. Tagore took liberties with his own scripts, constantly modifying it to suit every performance. In fact, his scripts, as Lal observes, were only skeletons for the performance that took diverse forms. According to Tagore, theatre best captured the imagination of the actor and spectator when it was devoid or made minimal use of scenery and the stage and relied more on the abilities of the actor to mime her surroundings. There was a minimal use of stage craft and the scenery, and the emphasis entirely on the actor's ability to mime her surroundings. This is unlike the European who, according to Tagore, needed to seek concrete truths and realistic representations of reality. This came through in the plays he directed and performed in his school Shantiniketan in the 1900s and 1910s. Not only did Tagore enable the possibility of women acting alongside men on stage, he also wrote plays that had a woman-only cast. Even when his plays were staged in Calcutta, they retained a minimalist stagecraft. Some of his plays had a chorus of singers who sat off stage to sing for the actors on stage. Tagore mostly avoided professional theatre for its commercial pressures and stage restrictions, although few of his plays did go on to become box office hits. After Tagore's death, Shomu Mitra's theatre group Bahurupi went on to perform some of Tagore's later plays in Calcutta and outside Bengal. So that was a very brief overview of these three important 19th century playwrights, Rabindranath Tagore, Bhartendu Harishchandra and Jayashankar Prasad. Now for a brief overview of post-colonial Indian theatre. Theatre scholar Aparna Dharwadker locates the beginnings of post-colonial Indian theatre in three events: the formation of the Indian People's Theatre Association or IPTA in 1943, the deliberations of the first drama seminar organized by the newly constituted Sangeet Natak Academy in 1956, and the 2-week Nehru Centenary Theatre Festival organized by the Sangeet Natak Academy in 1989. The IPTA was the first national level theatre movement in India and operated as the cultural front of the Communist Party of India, which sought to combat fascism and imperialism, drawing from several similar international movements. The formation of IPTA paralleled the Progressive Writers Association that was established in 1936. The IPTA was against the commercial glamour of contemporary theatre and relied on local performative forms to reject colonial commercial forms of the 19th century. As Malini Bhattacharya states, IPTA had two objectives: to develop experimental forms outside the naturalistic confines of commercial theatre and to present real contemporary struggles against fascism, imperialism and economic exploitation by drawing from India's traditional arts. The most successful example of IPTA plays was Bijon Bhattacharya's Nabonno or The New Harvest, 1944, first produced by Shomu Mitra, which is the beginning of post-colonial theatre in India. In practice, however, IPTA kept social realism as its aesthetic focus and experimented with both indigenous and Western forms. The IPTA movement was ignored, if not dismissed, in nationalist histories and statements on Indian theatre as a form of theatre that had paid no attention to aesthetics or the aesthetic unity of Indian culture and instead sought to harness art for its political ideologies and propaganda. These thinkers were, of course, oblivious to the class differences that undermined any notion of a national consciousness. Finally, it was the ideological differences between the Communist Party's political program and Nehru's Fabian socialist democracy, Dharwadker argues, that undermined the radical nature of the IPTA and transformed the CPI, the Communist Party of India, and its cultural front into a more revisionist party. In its 5-day seminar on drama, Sangeet Natak Academy in 1956 saw theatre as a medium of cultural reconstruction and social reform. Notable writers and playwrights and directors like Mulkraj Anand, Adya Rangacharya, Shomu Mitra, Ibrahim Al-Qazi, Balraj Sani, Dina Gandhi and so on critiqued the obsoleteness of colonial theatre and felt that the future of Indian theatre lay in its folk traditions and not its commercial theatre that was restricted by the proscenium arch. Thus, serious non-commercial theatre, they felt, was the future of Indian theatre. Shomu Mitra's Bohrupi and Ibrahim Al-Qazi's theatre group were examples of non-professional but artistically serious groups that set the trend for post-independence Indian theatre. The seminar further recommended that the Indian government repeal the colonial law of censorship against seditious theatre, exempt theatre from entertainment tax, to allocate funds for new and struggling theatre companies, and set up a central institute for comprehensive training in theatre. And in 1989 festival marking Nehru's 100th birth anniversary, the Sangeet Natak Academy came up with a list of notable plays and playwrights that anticipated the emergent drama canon. But from the seminar, what emerged was the fact that despite the urge to bridge the gap between urban and rural theatre, most of the theatre groups were urban-based and employed urban actors. Parsi theatre drew from Western conventions of theatre, including lighting and scenography, and drew from Perso-Arabic performance, poetic and musical traditions like the Shahnama, Arabian Nights, the singing and performance traditions of 19th century Indian courtesans, Victorian melodrama from Shakespeare as performed by Western touring companies, European realistic narrative structures, British amateur theatricals, and the visual regime of Raja Ravi Verma. But later post-independence playwrights were more keen on incorporating folk traditions, which they transformed and adapted in their own plays, both folk traditions as well as Puranic myths. Thus, playwrights like B.V. Karanth and K.S. Karanth included Yakshagana, a northern Karnataka tradition of folk theatre, which included the use of masks, singing, and percussive instruments along with dancing. The first generation of post-independence playwrights like Vijay Tendulkar, Girish Karnad, Habib Tanveer, and Bal Sarkar came to constitute what was called the theatre of roots that was prominent from the 1960s to the 1980s. So also Erin Mee's book on the roots of the theatre of roots, which is also another important source for this introduction. The objective of this style of theatre was to recover and revive pre-modern theatrical forms that were said to be free of the contamination of the colonial encounter and to get rid of the proscenium theatre in order to enable a greater intimacy between the actor and the spectator. Some feeble attempts were initially made in the 1960s and 70s by making actors sit in the audience, such as crowd or processional scenes in the auditorium. This was a process of decolonization of Indian lifestyle, values, social institutions, creative forms, and cultural modes. Ibrahim Al-Qazi, as director of National School of Drama, used a variety of spaces to perform his plays also because the school never had a proscenium theatre. The Bengali playwright Bal Sarkar used ordinary halls and public parks and rejected proscenium theatre to form something that came to be called third theatre. Thus, theatre was used to create its own space rather than the other way around, thus blurring the very distinction between the performance space and the space of the audience. This can be clearly seen in the travelling performances of the Leela tradition. And after breaking away from Western realism, the new theatre took to stylization to transform the dramatic text into performance and performative space. As theatre scholar Suresh Avasthi points out, the staging science in realistic theatre was kept to a minimum to retain the integrity of the verbal science, but in stylistic theatre, stage directions were maximized that considerably lengthened the duration of the performance. The emphasis in the theatre of roots movement is on form that is integral to the content. This form involved the art of the actor and not the dominance of the director, as Avasthi argues. And this can be seen in the plays of K.N. Panikkar, who used Kathakali and Kudiyattam, or Ratan Tiyam and his use of Manipuri martial arts, and B.V. Karanth, who deployed Yakshagana. The role of the actor is to decode the stylized codes of the script, Avasthi says, and encode it in the production. There is no rehearsal but rigorous training that the actors require in traditional dance forms, while each performance of the text is unique and to an extent extempo. It was the stylized quality of Sanskrit dramas that drew Panikkar, Karanth, and Tiyam to the Sanskrit classics, and each director produced a new stylized adaptation of the classic that was a new performance in its own right. Music and dance is more functional and integral to their performances, and the actors often step in and out of character. Like Harishchandra earlier, Brecht had this decisive influence on Karanth too, who often imagined the actor maintaining and distance from and uniting with the character he plays to create a defamiliarizing effect. Other playwrights like Ratan Tiyam drew from the theatre of roots as practiced by Shanta Gandhi, Habib Tanveer, K.N. Panikkar to make theatre into a spectacle which is mostly shorn of language and emphasized the ability of silence and the movements of the actor's body to communicate to the audience. He drew from Manipuri martial arts and the lyrical Vaishnava traditions of Manipur, thus exposing the very idea of traditional theatre as an ideological construct that critiqued modern societies and the unitary spirit of nationalism that attempted to erase all difference and the very presence of colonialism. But the very process of self-conscious recovery was itself conditioned by colonial knowledge, which irreversibly transformed folk elements of Indian theatre to cater to the needs of urban theatre, much of which was performed within the stationary enclosed space of the proscenium theatre. So this is a very important point that these theatre scholars make, which is that the very process, the very act of trying to revive and recuperate earlier folk forms was itself inflected, mediated, conditioned by colonial knowledge, so that it was no longer possible to actually recover an innocent form of pre-colonial theatre which had not been touched by the lens of colonial urban theatre. This was a far cry from the mobile open-air theatre of Indian folk and street theatre, where natural light was used and there was no scenography, and the play itself depended on the actor rather than the playwright or the director. There may not have been any script in the first place. The idealism of the new nation was followed by the disillusionment with the nation, which set the tone for the dark social realism of the 1950s and 60s in the plays of Dharamveer Bharti in Hindi, 1926 to 1997, Mohan Rakesh, 1925 to 1972, Vijay Tendulkar, 1928 to 2008, who all shared an existential vocabulary that exposed social corruption. Girish Karnad, born 1938, reconstructed myths to a modernist idiom where characters were internally divided by their own desire for power and love. Another important figure who put in place the modernist realist idiom in Hindi theatre was Ibrahim Alkazi. His staging of Mohan Rakesh's Ashad Ka Ek Din, or A Day in the Month of Ashad, and Dharamveer Bharti's Andha Yug, or The Blind Age, represented these plays in unprecedented realist detail. Alkazi paid more attention to stage pictures, which are quite distinct from Parsi theatre or B.V. Karan's experiments. Theatre scholar Aparna Dharwadker argues for a new imagination of Indian theatre, not as a singular essence or as a multilingual disparity of performative texts, but as a network of interactive possibilities, an aggregate of texts and performances mediated by aesthetic choices, institutions, and reception contexts. She identifies three models of authorship among post-independence playwrights, where the playwright simultaneously performed other roles as theorist and director. In the first group, she includes Dharamveer Bharti, known for his Hindi play Andha Yug, Mohan Rakesh, known for his Hindi plays Ashad Ka Ek Din and Aadhe Adhure, Girish Karnad, G.P. Deshpande, Mahesh Alkanchwar, and Mohit Chattopadhyay, whose plays were primarily meant to be read as literary texts rather than to be performed, and whose plays approximated the early generation of playwrights Tagore, Michael Madhusudan Dutt, Jayashankar Prasad, and Premchand. The second category of playwrights, Vijay Tendulkar, Satish Alekar, and Chandrasekhar Kambar, collaborate with resident playwrights, directors, and actors even as they retain their literary identities. The success of both these categories of playwrights, Dharwadker argues, lay in the publication of the playwrights of their plays in the respective languages and their translation to other languages, particularly Hindi, that brought them to critical attention and enabled their circulation and performance by other critical readers. This was first enabled by the Sangeet Natak Academy to forge a modern canon of Indian theatre, where even playwrights translated each other's works to make them available to a wider audience. The third model of playwrights includes Utpal Dutt, Badal Sarkar, Habib Tanveer, K.N. Panikar, Ratan Tiyam, and Mahesh Dattani, who are authors, actors, directors, and founder managers of their own experimental theatre groups. This lent them greater flexibility and skill and freedom as artists to create their own aesthetic. In an institutional culture where directors have been trained over playwrights, there have also been important collaborations between directors and the playwrights they choose to patronize. But there have also been multiple choices of performance in a diverse theatre culture, where the playwright and the script are not the only determinant factors, but coexist with many folk traditions where the performance itself is central. So we need to have any history of modern Indian theatre has to take into consideration these different traditions, these different forms, and not try and assimilate them into any particular monolithic essence which suits or caters to the aspirations of nationalism. The first historical movement identified theatre with the nation from 1870s to 1940s in regional expressions of Marathi and Bangla, and national level organizations like the Indian People's Theatre Association and Bharatiya Natya Sangh. The second developed a revisionary account of theatre and its role in post-independence India and the establishment of the Sangeet Natak Academy. The third led to the proliferation of theatre activity outside the radical position of the 1940s and revisionary discourses of the 1950s. So this is a brief overview of the late 19th century playwrights and an overview of post-colonial Indian theatre. Thank you.